1045 The Team and 1045theteam.com, the producer of the Showtime film Perfect in 76 about Bobby Knight's perfect season at Indiana. Ross Greenburg joins us. Ross, what in particular made you interested in being a part of this film?
Well, it started to kick in when Kentucky was on their run a few years back, and I kept reading the paragraphs about the last team to run the table, Indiana Hoosiers in 76, realized it was a Bob Knight coach team. I've always been fascinated by him as a character. I called Sandy Montag, his agent, and I said, would Bob ever agree to be a part of this kind of a documentary? Because, I knew that Bob did not want to do the definitive Bob Knight docu because of all the negativity about his temper and everything. But I thought if we focused on 76 that he would be amenable to it because he had such a love affair with that team and the players. So we set out to do it then and got the good word from Sandy when he had talked to Bob, and we made it happen. So we're real proud of what we did, and I think we take you back to a time and a place that's long forgotten and a coach that's long forgotten because everyone's kind of ripped from the headlines and just kind of focused on his temper tantrums and didn't pay enough attention to him as the quality of coach that he deserved.
Now, you mentioned the latest Kentucky teams and how they were going on their run. Is there any way Bobby Knight's style would have any chance of working in today's game the way it did back then?
Elements of it would. I mean, his intensity, his drive of his players, his ability to get inside their heads and kind of convince them that they were champions. I think those kinds of elements as a coach would work. Also, his fanaticism on creating a defensive scheme and an offensive scheme, but particularly defense, obviously would work with the modern-day player. I think his focus and the fact that he paid attention to every detail and committed his players to doing the same would also work today. Some of the other things may not. I don't know if, his toughness and the fact he would take a guy like Weisman off the court, and rattle him a little bit, that obviously wouldn't work, and he might have gotten thrown off the court and thrown out of the school for the first behavior problem that he exhibited. So, that in this day and age. So, but for the most part, great coaches transcend eras, and Bob Knight certainly does that.
Now, going back to his days at Indiana, in an interview today he did with Dan Patrick, he said that he would not want to go back to the university and not reconcile with them after his leave from there. Do you see any possible way that there could be a reconciliation between the two sides and bring him back to the University of Indiana?
No, I mean, I talked to Sandy Montag about that to see if there was any way we could screen this in Indiana, but I think the wound is too raw, too deep, and Bob is a very tough-minded individual who has his principles, and I don't know the specifics of what happened at the very end other than Indiana just, letting him go, but he's someone that felt like he was burned at the end by his university, and I just don't. If he says that he's not going to do something, Bob Knight's not going to do something. Let's put it that way. That's the type of man he is. So I would doubt there will ever be a reconciliation. It would take something extraordinary or someone's relationship in Indiana to reach out to Bob that would change that, and that's always possible if it's the right person. Bob Hamill, who's predominant in our documentary, would be that type of person. If he ever, wanted to try to orchestrate it, he has the trust of Bob Knight, but it would take someone like that to turn the table and have Bob go back.
Any particular Bob Knight story during the process of this film that really, stood out to you?
Well, honestly, I didn't realize that, number one, in 75, he puts most of the blame on himself for the only loss in those two seasons to Kentucky in the Elite Eight in the tournament in 1975, and that he felt when May went down and he had Wilkerson and Quinn Buckner kind of fall back and help out the forwards defensively, that he and he alone had caused the loss, because he took the two best defensive guards in college basketball history and kind of screwed up in that game. And then off of that, you know, he knew that he had the best college basketball team in the country, not only in 76 but in 75. And so when he kind of got to practice for the first day, he sat down his team and said, "Look, it's not about winning the Big Ten championship. It's not about winning the NCAA tournament. I challenge you this year to go undefeated," because he knew he had the talent to do that. And then they did it. So that surprised the hell out of me. I was completely unaware that he had done that. And when we first talked to Bob, you know, when we started the process of making the film, that was the first thing he talked about. He said, "You know, I gave them a speech and gave them a challenge at the beginning of the year at the first practice," and he came out with that speech. And so, you know, that was a shock to me, because it's one thing to go undefeated, it's another thing to set up a plan to go undefeated.
You mentioned Bobby Knight being the guy that would rile his team up. Was that an aspect of him you wanted to try to portray in this film?
Yeah, I you know, because that's bringing you to a place where you don't normally go as a viewer, into the locker room to listen in and hear the stories of what went on. Whether it's, you know, him at halftime in the Michigan final, you know, and exactly what he said to get them to have that 57-point second half to win it, or his little, you know, sessions with his players where he would take the words and wisdom of Red Auerbach or Pete Newell and put them on a little recorder and have them just sit there and listen to these championship words of wisdom coming from Red Auerbach or Pete Newell. You know, those are the kinds of stories that were very important to us, George Roy, Steve Stern, and I, in making the film, to bring it all home and to kind of give you the inside story.
And is there anything in particular you want the listeners to take out of this film?
Just understand that Bob Knight, you know, has become a caricature, and that he wasn't, and that he was a very gifted coach who had an incredible bond with his players. You know, Quinn Buckner and I spoke a couple weeks ago, and Quinn mentioned to me that, you know, he did this interview, and this docu was a part of this docu for Coach. He calls him Coach still. You know, he's over 60 years old, but he still refers to him as Coach. I think that's kind of cool, and that kind of sets the tone that we're trying to create in this docu, to explain the bond between coach and player in 1976, which is a different bond than it is today. You know, in this one-and-done era, it's hard for us to understand how these coaches molded young men, and that's the big takeaway.
Producer of the Showtime film Perfect in 76, Ross Greenburg, thank you so much for your time today.
All right, I appreciate it. Enjoyed it.